Hello, welcome to Screen Vision. What's this? We're talking about a book. A book. Yeah, we're talking about a book. A read. Let me paint a picture for you. The year is 2011. I'm doing my GCSEs, and the prescribed text that we were allocated was To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and I doubt I really need to explain To Kill a Mockingbird to anyone. Um, if you're the one of the few people who doesn't know what To Kill a Mockingbird is, or you know what it is but you've not read it, or you don't really understand the kind of historical value, I will explain it, but I don't really think this reaction video, which is going to be full of spoilers, is for you. This is gonna. I'm gonna assume you haven't. I'm gonna assume you've read and understood To Kill a Mockingbird, but To Kill a Mockingbird was released in. Ooh, I don't even have to Google it because it will be in the, I assume, the blurb of this book somewhere. I assume this book was mentioned when Harper Lee wrote it. Because I can't actually remember. When was it written? Okay, never mind. You got explanation on the font type, but not an explanation on Okay, never mind. I can't remember top of my head when To Kill a Mockingbird was written, which is, I think, terrible of me. I'm gonna just quickly Google it, which is probably what I should have done originally. 1960. So, what was my point? Damn it. Okay. Anyway, To Kill a Mockingbird was written in 1960, and it was basically it's critically. I mean, it's critically acclaimed. It's like one of the it's most people have consider it one of like the best one of the best books of all time. It is often regarded as approaching the topic of the civil rights movement, of racial equality, of prejudice in, even though it's written by a white author, I've yet to see anyone who really criticizes it, because despite what detractors think, we do understand the concept of products being of the time. And, even despite being a product of its time, it's fairly progressive. And especially as a product of its time, it's very progressive. So yeah, I'm not gonna really. So yeah, it was 2010, 11. I read the book as part of my GCSEs. I really enjoyed the book. I hate doing favorites. So often when I'm asked what's my favorite book and I have to choose one, I say To Kill a Mockingbird. It's certainly one of my favorite books. I think what I like more about To Kill a Mockingbird, other than obviously it being a very well written book and it being one that explores the concept of inequality in a way which is very accessible. I read the book as a, how old would I have been? 15, 16-year-old, and it wasn't too complicated, even though the topic is a fairly complicated one. Well, that's not. I mean, racism being bad is complicated, but there's a lot of nuances to civil action, or civil rights. But I think what the biggest impact for To Kill a Mockingbird to me and why it's resonated with me so much is it's the first kind of real experience where I kind of fell in love with the idea of media analysis as a field. And it's a good entry book for media analysis because you can read it and you can get a appreciation of things like subtextual importance and historical context and you know literacy devices and people being representation of messages that aren't explicit. And again, To Kill a Mockingbird doesn't really do anything groundbreaking or extreme particularly. That's why it's a GCSE level textbook. But for someone who hadn't really approached the field of media analysis before, it was certainly one that was a nice introduction into it. So I read that 2010, 11, and then what would have been 3 years later, I was in my first year of university, and it was announced that a sequel was being released for To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think the most important thing, well, so as we discuss this book, and I go over the thoughts in my head, and this is unscripted, so I'm literally going to be rambling at you. There's much to talk about how this book came about than there is to talk about the actual book itself. And I don't think you can separate the context. I don't know where I meant to hold this. I don't think you can separate the context of, or rather the contents of this book without talking about how it came about. I mean, you can, and we will, but we need to talk about that first. Because this was marketed, and I remember being excited. This was announced. I was excited. I pre-ordered this book. That's how much excited I was. I don't often pre-order things. I think the only book I pre-ordered is The Tales of Beedle the Bard. And that was simply because we were in Waterstones that day and you could do so, and I did. But this I deliberately went out went out my way to pre-order. And it came out in 2015, I believe. That should be in the book. Yep, 2015. And I got it. I think I read about like half of the first chapter. I think I read about. Yeah, I think I've read about this much of the book. And then, like, if you've been to university, you'll know it's a time of life when especially in your first year, where a lot of things are happening. You're a lot of self-discovery, a lot of you're living your life in a completely different way. You've got to do with the scale of independence, different lifestyles, your degree or your exams, all of that stuff. Things very quickly get away from you. Reading this book was one of that. So I read about the first chapter. Then one day something must have come up. I got distracted, probably got traumatized. My mental health was really, really bad back then, and I just never finished this book. Skip forward to this year, and I don't know what it was that triggered it, but I kind of got this urge again to start reading, because when I was at school, until I moved to university, I used to read a lot. And like the further back you go, the more I used to read. I think, obviously before I started getting really big into streaming, before I had as much access as I did to streaming content online, before I had access to all the gaming stuff. And this makes me sound very much like, oh, well, before we had all these games and stuff, and back in the old days kind of thing. I had a big collection of books, and I used to read a lot. And I don't think it's because of the games and everything that stopped happening. I think it's just because I've become busy and my priorities have changed. But I made a kind of loose commitment, which is, it sounds like it's definitely an oxymoron, but a loose commitment to do more reading. And I was like, I got this book in 2015. It's now 2024. It's 9 years later. I'm gonna read the book, and I did. I've read the entire book, and it's So we still have to talk about 2015. So this book came out. It was marketed as a sequel, a long lost sequel. So they made it very clear that this was written back in the day. It wasn't something that Harper Lee had only just authored. She was still alive when this came out. I think she died a couple of years after that. But they didn't make it. There wasn't much. Then slowly some details came out. So this isn't actually a sequel. So what came out next, I think, was the revelation that it was actually written before To Kill a Mockingbird. So the stance they were going with was that this was written first, and then happily went back and wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. So which as a kind of a retroactive prequel. Then it came out and people read it, and more of the truth came out. And the truth is that this isn't even a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird. This is what was written before To Kill a Mockingbird as a first draft, or at least an early draft, not maybe a first draft, but certainly a revision that was not intended for release. And at some point, Happy's editor was like, "You've got some good themes, but the book's a mess." Gave him a bunch of notes, and Happy was like, "Okay, rather than trying to rewrite this book, they're going to basically write a new book, tackling the themes, but from a different perspective." I think so. Part of this book is set. Okay, so this book is set 20 years after the events of To Kill a Mockingbird, and we see a 26-year-old Jean Louise, formerly Scout, and everyone else is 20 years older. And there's a whole bunch of characters in this book who are in To Kill a Mockingbird, and there's a whole bunch of characters who are new. So, and there's sections of this book, like prolonged chapters, a whole like chunk, where we flash back to a teenage scout, so a scout who's in secondary school, which is still older than she was in To Kill a Mockingbird, and she's going through certain things. There's a prolonged chapter about her having a pregnancy scare so bad she literally becomes suicidal, which, wow, is dark, and a strong indictment against piss poor sex education. But yeah, there was literally a point. There's a chapter where there's a part where we talk about how we explore Scout's kind of first time dealing with having a period, and then there's a part where, because obviously she doesn't know where babies come from, and she's given the misconception that of how that kind of come about, and she goes through an entire 9-month period of being riddled with anxiety over the fact that she might be pregnant when she's not, that she then pledges to like kill herself the day before she's meant to give birth, and she literally is standing on the edge of a tower, and it's only until one of her friends kind of like stops her that she doesn't, and that's dark. That's really dark. But there's the like kind of the flashbacks to a younger Scout, and I think that's what encouraged Happy to rewrite this as To Kill a Mockingbird that was set 20 years earlier as Scout as a child and from Scout's perspective, because the flashbacks to Scouts, it's still set as it's still told from a third party narrator, but it's more POV, whereas To Kill a Mockingbird is first person from Scout. And you can see why that kind of happens. And that's an interesting kind of thing you've got to keep in mind when you read this book, because it's not even a retroactive sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, because this is set because this is written as an early revision of To Kill a Mockingbird, and then To Kill a Mockingbird was written, and it was completely written as a independent thing. Like, okay, so there is a lot of controversy which we won't get into because we don't really know the truth about whether or not this book Happily wouldn't book be released. You know, on one side, the publishers are like, Happily gave her blessing, she was fine with this being released, signed the paperwork. On the other hand, we have the whole thing about, you know, capacity, and Happily was very old, and people being like, well, she's at that age, she would have been very easy to kind of manipulate into signing papers. Some people even, I think her sister or someone's even said that Happily at that age would just sign anything that was put in front of her, and so she didn't actually give consent for this to be released. We don't know what the truth is, but I imagine at least there is some truth to the fact that this wasn't written, or the manuscript for this wasn't, To Kill a Mockingbird wasn't written to be a prequel to this book. It wasn't written to be consistent with this book. And that's a big thing to keep in mind, because the biggest thing about this book, and if you know anything about this book, you would have heard about it in the news, is that Atticus, who in To Kill a Mockingbird, and in To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus is a massive proponent for racial equality and civil rights, and, you know, stands as a figure of that. And that his role in that book is so prominent that, being that figure, that the character has kind of transcended the book as becoming an icon for the civil rights movement as a fictional character. That he's inspired people to become lawyers and become civil rights activists. So when you read this book and you find out that in this, Atticus Finch is a unapologetic racist. Like it gets discussed, and there's always the kind of underlying feeling that because Scout doesn't confront Atticus about it until about 2/3 through the book, and we learn that he's a racist about a third way through the book, or like give or take. So there's always that underlining, and I don't know if that's intended in the book or if that's just my own pre-knowledge of Atticus as a character. But there's always that kind of underlying feeling that Atticus being a racist isn't the entire truth, and in fact, Scout is very much. I think actually is part of the book because Scout is very much like, what is Atticus playing at? What's the game here? Can someone tell me what's going on? Am I missing something? That's happening throughout the book, and you live in hope that's the case. But no, at the end, Atticus full on says, "I don't believe in these." In basically, Atticus's whole stance is that he doesn't believe that the Supreme Court should be able to have jurisdiction at a district level. I can't pretend to have a full level understanding of U.S. politics, both current or in the 1950s, and I suppose I'm gonna keep engaging with more analyses of these books, and I'm sure I'll learn more through that. But a degree of understanding of that. The thing about this book is also more complicated. Well, let me finish my point. I'm bouncing my points here. This book is more complex than To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird is pretty straightforward to understand what the themes are, what the historical context is, what's going on. It's very easy to understand, and I think that's by design. I think Harper Lee wrote this and then wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, and because that was obviously To Kill a Mockingbird was a later draft of this, obviously the ideas are much more streamlined and much more coherent. And equally, it's a bit more timeless. Like, even though it's set in the year it's set, it's still, you can still understand the context. This is a much more this is deliberately set against the backdrop of Supreme Court decisions. I think Brown versus something, I can't remember the actual name of the legislation because I'm not an expert in American history. But it's deliberately set against that context. It makes deliberate references to it and expects you to understand its context. It makes deliberate references to the history of the Civil War and expects you to understand the context of it, because I imagine in the 1950s that it's something that people would have much more of a kind of a comfortable casual knowledge of, whereas To Kill a Mockingbird you don't need to have all that knowledge and makes it much more streamlined. So this is a much more complicated book, and it does tackle the idea of race inequality in a much deeper way. It tackles aspects of civil rights in a much deeper way and explores other concepts of the civil movements. I was reading it being like, okay, this is tackling much more deeper concepts, and I haven't quite locked onto what its message of the book is, and it's not clear if the book knows what its message is, and that might just be because, again, it's not a finished book. Like, despite what the publisher is saying about this being a publishable manuscript, and it was finished at a publishable manuscript, I think that's a lie. I think knowing what we know about this being an earlier draft of To Kill a Mockingbird, and To Kill a Mockingbird being a much more published read, and just, I read it being like, have I become just a worse reader? But no, knowing all that, I think I'm pretty confident in saying that this just isn't finished. Like, it's like there are parts which you're reading and it just goes on for too long, and you're like, what was the book actually trying to tell me here? And I don't think it's trying to tell me anything, because I think Harper Lee has an intent for it, but they've not streamlined it. Because that's what happens. You write a book, it's not, your first drafts aren't coherent, and then you go back and you make it more coherent. So whatever the message is, I think it's lost in that context. I jumped to a different point, and I can't remember the point I was making before I interrupted myself. But essentially, Atticus is basically saying they are racist. It's simply a case of they don't want the Supreme Court to have power over district level decisions, and he's more than happy. But he also says, and on principle, he's happy to fight against that, even if it means fighting against the civil rights movement, which does want that. But he also says that he thinks that the black population are being given too many liberties too quickly, and it's going to hurt them. Because they don't, you're basically implying that the black population doesn't know what's good for them, and that it's the job of white people to decide. Like, he's the kind of thing where it's like, black people are people, but they're kind of children, and the white people need to look after them. So rather than being like the white person should suppress and use black people as cattle, he's more progressive than that, but only in the sense that he believes that black people should be cared for because they don't have that And whether that's because he thinks that, and, you know, he gives a good bunch of justifications for it. It's all racist. It's terribly racist. So Icus is unapologetically racist in here, despite how he justifies it. I know there was a big backlash, but then you read the history about his book, and it kind of then, as a text, becomes a bit more complicated. Because is it fair? It is, you know, people in real life. One of them kind of poisoned us, the double. I'm mixing my metaphors here. One of the things of progressiveness is that it's a continued journey, you know, and we see this with authors all the time. Gene Roddenberry was a progressive TV producer for the 1960s. He pushed for diversity and depictions and progressive attitudes on TV for its time. If Gene Roddenberry was making TV nowadays, he would not be progressive. He can't progressive. He would be, or maybe he would do. Obviously, it's hard to say. I don't, because I don't want to speak for the dead. But he was already being pushed out of Star Trek by the 70s and even by the 80s. And some of that I think was because and if you read about his behind the scenes conduct, you get the feeling that some of that is maybe because he wasn't no longer as progressive as he kind of needed to be. Joss Whedon is potentially another example of that. It's hard to say. Obviously, Joss Whedon is still a living person, and there's more that maybe might come to light, and the more that has come to light about Joss Whedon as a person. But you know, there was a time where I thought Joss Whedon was someone who was progressive for the 90s, but then just stopped because they were being congratulated so much that they were as progressive, the symbols of progressive writing, that they stopped feeling the need to improve themselves. I don't know if that is a case or not. I don't know Joss Whedon personally. I absolutely believe everything that's being said about him in terms of how he was on or behind screen, because there's enough people saying it that it likely is to an extent somewhat true. Women don't lie about a single person in such a way. I don't think Joss Whedon's the victim of a witch hunt. Again, I don't know the reality, and I never will. But so whether or not Joss Whedon was a fake progressive person, or he was generally progressive, but then let kind of his own ego take a charge, or whatever it is, it happens all the time. Even J.K. Rowling was like considered progressive at the time, although I'm not going to erase history. There were detractors. I think they were just ignored because of how popular Harry Potter is, and then now Harry Potter has had a decline. They're finally having their limelight, and good on them for having that patience. Because it's, you know, now you look at Harry Potter with a less kind of rose-tinted lens. You do see the degree of racism and just everything else that's in it, anti-Jewishness and stuff like that. So people like that exist that are progressive in their youth and then just stop progressing and then become reactionaries, and you know, at that point they become the enemy, and that's just a tragedy that's either a tragedy or a deliberate kind of thing. I don't know if it's tragedy or not, but it's sad. So you know, if Icus Finch was a real person, it's very possible that he could have been this progressive lawyer in his youth. I say his youth. I mean, it's still 20 years, it's 2 decades, but even that's enough time. He could be a progressive lawyer and then become much more reactionary as he's older. That's possible. But the way his opinions have changed isn't something that seems like it would be he seems more aggressive in this book, more reactionary in this book than he was 20 years younger. Usually when the progressive person stops being progressive, they stop. And they hold their progressive views for the time, but just don't progress to the new ones. And that's how they become reactionary, by stopping being progressive. Whereas his views here are much worse than the views. I think it's hard to say. Obviously, he doesn't really express much in terms of. I mean, again, it's hard to say because he's reacting to. They don't really. It's unclear. It's unclear, and that's part of the problem. Because obviously they're not intended to be a progression of a character. It's not intended to be Icus Finch set 20 years later on. It's a different character, because this is a different story. This isn't a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, or neither is To Kill a Mockingbird a prequel to this book. They are two different books with the same characters in the same setting, in a sense. Or at least that's the intent of the writing. Like, this book was never meant to be that. And you can't. So you've got to read, and so in a sense, you've got to read this book, not pretending that you don't actually know about To Kill a Mockingbird, and read it as its own independent thing, because this character of Atticus was written differently to how Atticus was written in To Kill a Mockingbird, possibly. But the other twist about Knife is that one of the big themes of this book, maybe the biggest theme, is disillusionment. Disillusionment. This is a book about Scout, about Jean Louise becoming disillusioned with Atticus. And that's basically a journey of her. I mean, I think the quote in the book is that is for her to stop seeing Atticus as a god, an infallible god, and as a fallible human. And her arc finishes when she accepts Atticus as a fallible human and goes, okay, well, it's fine if you're racist, because I know you're a fallible human, so I love you anyway, which is a problematic aspect to have. Again, why this book isn't all what it is. But obviously, so that's one of the themes, is disillusion of a character. And it's a journey that we as a reader can follow Scout on much more intimately if you read To Kill a Mockingbird, especially if you read it years ago. So you're kind of going on the same journey as Scout. You're kind of being like, well, Atticus was this heroic figure, and now I'm reading this book, and he's completely like not that. So even though it's not written in the same continuity, that's basically what I'm saying here. The two books are not set in the same continuity. They're like deliberate contradictions. A big one being that, obviously, in To Kill a Mockingbird, Tommy Robinson was found guilty and then died in prison. In this book, an event which is mentioned in one line, so it's not like explicit, but it seems to be referring to the same court case. Tommy Robinson was exonerated. So it's like clearly not set in the same continuity. They're not the same characters. You read this as an alternate. One reading of this book is basically a alternate universe where Atticus was a slightly different person. But that being said, obviously you can read this book having read Kill a Mockingbird, having put Atticus on a pedestal, and that allows you to go through the same journey Jean Louise is, because she's also having put Atticus on a pedestal, and it's easier to see Atticus as a pedestal if you've previously seen him as a hero character. Whereas I don't know if I just read this book in isolation, would I have ever assumed I have to have, I mean, I have to go by Scout's word, but Atticus was this virtuous figure, because nothing in the book would suggest it to me. In fact, I doubt actually if I'd read this book without having read To Kill a Mockingbird that I would hold the opinion that Atticus was ever a good person, because I think I read this book in entire time being completely disgusted by Atticus. So I don't think I'd ever hold that view, even as much as Scout or Jack or any of the other characters are talking about it. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It's like, how do you read this? And I think, I wonder if this book, I don't know if To Kill a Mockingbird is still on a GCSE syllabus, and I wonder if this book is going to be discussed in schools. But I think it's going to be a debate question. It's like, it's definitely an essay topic. Should you read Go Set A Watchman in the context of To Kill a Mockingbird, or in spite of the context of To Kill a Mockingbird? And I think both work, and both give you slightly different takes, or rather two different slants towards the material. Because like I say, stylistically, we know this wasn't written. This was written before To Kill a Mockingbird was even conceptualized, and To Kill a Mockingbird was written as a completely separate piece of work. It was basically this refined. But the Atticus Finch of To Kill a Mockingbird, it was never intended to be a younger version of this Atticus Finch. But it kind of works. You can make it work. Kind of. Enough. Thematically. But just not in execution. I'm talking a lot about the relationship between To Kill a Mockingbird and Go Set A Watchman, because you can't really talk about this book without doing that. I mean, this is the UK book cover. I know the American book cover is a bit different, but the connection is so much part of the whole process that they even like put in orange writing, so that you can't actually really see it if you unless you look at it properly. It has To Kill a Mockingbird, so you know it's connected, and that's obviously a drawing of a mockingbird. The other thing is obviously is that they kind of, it's interesting. You read this book and they don't contextualize any of its relationship to Kill a Mockingbird. I think like they don't clarify for you, but they don't even clarify for you that it was written before To Kill a Mockingbird. I've just reread the sleeve text, and it says, it not only confirms the enduring brilliance of To Kill a Mockingbird, but it also serves as its essential companion, adding depth, context, and new meaning to the classic. I mean, that's bull for a start. I mean, no bull, but it's kind of like that's just taking the mickey of the whole concept. That's really, really suppressing the big debate that we should be having here about it. But no point in the book does it explain that this was written before To Kill a Mockingbird, unless you, I mean, it's obviously it says it's written in mid 1950s, but so was To Kill a Mockingbird, I assume, with it being written in 1960 or at least, so you assume it was in a few years prior, or at least a year prior, To Kill a Mockingbird was written. As an independent, okay, so as a book of itself, I've said it's a bit more difficult to consume. There are bodies of text that go on for like a long period of time, and you're not quite sure what's being said. I don't know if that's by design or not. There's a chapter where Jean Louise goes and visits Uncle Jack to basically be like, can you please help me understand what's going on with Icus right now? And Jack basically goes on this like long-winded description of loads of stuff, and Jean Louise is like, what the hell are you talking about? And that's me. I'm like, what the heck are you going on about? And it's like, I wasn't sure if like I'm not meant to understand what's going on or not. I mean, Jean Louise doesn't, and she certainly seems to think that Jack's being deliberately obfuscating about the answer. I mean, she leaves, and we stare at Jack for a second. He picks up a phone, and he's clearly pondering something. And then it's only later on, after she's had a meeting with Jack, does he then come back and like give a much more straighter answer? And it's kind of unclear. But certainly, it's people have said the writing isn't as coherent as To Kill a Mockingbird, and I think that's true. And I think that's a bigger kind of indication that it wasn't meant to be a released book as it was. And like I say, it tackles much more complicated, nuanced issues about race, in a way which is much harder to kind of understand what its message is. Because again, like it's not clear. Are we meant to agree or not that there's obviously Atticus's perspective about that black people aren't capable of moderating their own liberation. I mean, Scout is aghast at that, and obviously we know. I think with To Kill a Mockingbird being written after this, we can be clear that Where Happily kind of lies on that. So maybe, but it doesn't really like tackle it hugely, and it's like it's not clear. Again, if taking To Kill a Mockingbird out of the equation, it's not clear from the book what the book stance is on it. We know Scout's against it, but Scout gets ridiculed, and like Uncle Jack is like the voice of reason in the book. Like that's what he's portrayed as. Like Scout's portrayed as very emotive, and your protagonists are meant to have flaws that they grow through. So Scout's flaw. So here's the thing, and then actually I'll quote from the book here. Jack calls Scout a bigot. Calls Scout a bigot for intolerating Atticus's racist views. His perspective is that Scout should tackle and acknowledge and discuss and confront Atticus's racist views rather than disowning him as a person, which isn't an extremely progressive view to have. I mean, look, I come from a Muslim family, and I am a Muslim, and part of Islamic philosophy is that you should always love and support your parents despite their flaws, and that's something that I agree with. It's a difficult philosophy to really talk about in full modern context because you obviously have a concept idea of like abusive parents and stuff. And I don't want to get too deep into it because I don't want to disrail here. But that's also not what this book's talking about, because I think Jack would call her a bigot if someone who wasn't her father was expressing those views. And Hank, who is her partner in this book, she has a similar reaction too. And I think if Hank even cared to bring him up as well, he would have called her a bigot for rejecting Hank's views. So it seems that the book wants you to the book seems to be more about disillusionment and accepting people for their flaws and tackling their flaws rather than disowning them, more so than it seems to be about race. Race seems to be the kind of vehicle for that. Whereas from what I recall, and I reread To Kill a Mockingbird before I started reading this back in 2015, and I've not read it since. So my memory of To Kill a Mockingbird is simply the strong one I have from the amount of times I read it at GCSE level, and then that one time I read it after that. So I do have a very kind of strong recollection of To Kill a Mockingbird, but it's not intact. This book is more about Jean Louise as a person and pulling back to where the hell does she live? You think I would remember it given that Scout mentions it. Maycoop. Coming back to Maycoop, and everything being different, and her being like, well, I don't like change. And it's kind of pointed out, like, her whole thing is that she doesn't like change, but then she rejects against the reactionary views of her father. And it's kind of like, well, you're being a hypocrite. Like I say, dealing with quite much more nuanced concepts than To Kill a Mockingbird does, but not dealing with them very well. Because again, this wasn't a finished manuscript. I can believe that argument from having read it, but this wasn't a finished manuscript. So it's much more like difficult read in terms of just like comprehending it. You've got to stop a lot more and be like, well, what? I mean, if you're just reading it to read it, it's fine. If you're reading it to try and analyze it, it's definitely one you read once and then you got to read back again. And I haven't read this back again because I've only just finished reading it. So if you're going to give a very proper like analysis of it, you probably have to read it back again. Also, just to kind of reinforce the fact that this wasn't meant to be released alongside To Kill a Mockingbird, there are passages of this book, you can Google it and see them. I think I can't remember which newspaper it is that did the work, but there are literally word for word replications of text in here that were in To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird is meant to replace this, and they're not meant to be companion books to each other. They are set in different continuities, and continuity is often thrown on a lot as a term. It matters here as a concept because these aren't the same characters. But like I said, it's weird because you get different readings out of it if you choose to still consider them the same thing, and it doesn't entirely not work. But I think it's important to, again, like both this and To Kill a Mockingbird are books you have to have some understanding of environmental and social context to get the full meaning out of, and so that I think includes with this book you've got to know how it came about in terms of authorship, because the authorship intent of this book matters. But the themes are a bit choppy. It's unclear who we're meant to agree with between, say, so what I can make a point I was trying to make is like a lot of protagonists, Scout has a flaw, and her flaw, we are told, is her bigotry, her reluctance to her plan to disown her family rather than tackle their bigotry. And like Jack agrees that her view, both with actually fair, both Jack and Icus actually agree that Scout is right, that she is right to have progressive views, and she is right to vocalize them, and she is right to remove remove stop seeing her father as an infallible being. And Scout Atticus says that he is proud of Scout for being more progressive than he is, which is a kind of an odd perspective to have as a racist. It's kind of like, if you know you're wrong, stop being a racist. But like Atticus is that kind of place. Like I'm comfortable with the fact that I have now reached the end point of my progressive nature, and it's kind of a weird perspective to have. But again, this is from my modern sensibilities, and it's like, arguably he still would have been progressive by 1950 standards. So Scout's flaw as a character is her rigidness, her refusal to accept the fact that some people are just racist and having to like tolerate them. Like a lot of her deliberation is do I stay in Maycomb that I've always considered to be my home, despite the fact that I'm feeling this increased disconnect with the people who live here, or do I go back to New York, which is more progressive but doesn't represent that area of home? And Jack is like, you kind of need to stay in Maycomb because we need more people like you to be calling us out. And it's the fact that we don't have people like you, which is why all this racism is still being like, we need people like you to challenge the racism. So it's weird because it's like it's definitely putting anti-racism as a good perspective, but it's kind of, you've got the voice of wisdom and Atticus, who isn't the voice of wisdom in this book, but so Jack kind of has an Atticus role. Atticus in To Kill a Mockingbird was the voice of wisdom. Whenever Scout had an issue she wasn't quite able to understand, she would tell Atticus, and Atticus would drop words of wisdom, and that's like consistently through the book. We were meant to see Atticus as that figure, whereas in this book, Jack has become that figure because Atticus is now more of the antagonizing force. So I think we're meant to assume that Jack is the voice, the voice of reason, that we're meant to be kind of seeing as diplomatic, moral stance that guides Scout, and that's kind of the role he plays. And his view is that complicated view where it's like bigotry is bad, but you've got to accept it as part of life, kind of thing, which is a very kind of centric view to have. And it takes us a while to kind of get to that point. And we tackle other things. But I think there is a core theme in this book, and that is basically disillusionment and working around that, and that's kind of what's tackled here. It's definitely deeply inferior to Kill a Mockingbird, and I think it might be longer too. It looks bigger, but that might be because I own a hard book, a hard cover, hard book, soft book, what's it? Hard book. Hardback. No, yes. Why am I forgetting basic book terms? Hardback. Yeah. Okay, hardcover is a term. Hardback and paperback. That's kind of what we say. Maybe because I've got a hardback version of the book, and To Kill a Mockingbird I've read this in a paperback version. And I definitely agree that flashbacks to Jean Louise's childhood seem the more kind of coherent part of the book, or at least like the more well-structured parts of the book. Jack does actually seem like a much more different character than he does 20 years ago, but again, it's kind of like that people change in 20 years, so it can still kind of works even when it doesn't. It's definitely a book I think I'm going to form strong opinions of as I reread it. And again, I have to read a bunch of analyses. I want to understand more of the historical context because I think that's important. There's a lot of, if reading this the first time, I would suggest doing some homework first in terms of just what's going on with the civil rights movement at this time. Like especially around like the what is it, the NACP? Yeah, the NACP. What they're doing at this time is a big part of it. Brown versus, yeah, so it's the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. That's a big part of the backdrop, and I think understanding that is important going into this. Definitely read To Kill a Mockingbird first, and then make your own mind up about whether or not you think this works better for you as a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, albeit an inconsistent one, but one that still kind of kind of still works, or you read this as a kind of a alternate universe version of the same story set 20 years later. Like, everything that happened to Kill a Mockingbird doesn't happen in this universe. Something else similar happens, and this is set 20 years later. It's kind of like a what if Atticus was more racist than you remember, and then we jump forward 20 years and we see the kind of the thing about that. And yeah, it's interesting because it's interesting. It's definitely one that I want to explore more. Because like I say, I was a big fan of To Kill a Mockingbird when I read it. What do you think, Lily? Do you have any thoughts? Nope. Okay. Well, that's my first ever book review. I think it went very well. I clearly had a lot of thoughts. I was talking for a good 45 minutes on it. I might do more of these book things when I finish reading more books. But I'm glad I could have knocked another one off the shelf. Now I've got to finish. I finished Girl Up as well by Laura Bates because I've been reading that for years. I got finished reading the Star Wars book, Star Wars Jedi tie-in book that I bought a few months ago, and then we'll go back to my bookshelf. That might be my next book review. Anyway, I'm gonna eat food, and then I want to play Firefly. I want to play Fortnite because I'm behind Fortnite. Okay, goodbye. I've talked for too long.